The cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker is most well known for his 1973 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death. The premise of the book is that the primary psychological and sociological problem human beings face is not, as Freud would argue, the problem of how to cope with our sexuality and drives, but rather how to avoid being driven mad by the problem of death. Everyone, no matter how smart, how good-looking, how successful, how spiritual, how altruistic, ends up as worm food. We are, each and every one of us, ultimately no more lasting than a tissue paper, and no more significant than a head of cabbage or a jellyfish. For Becker, human beings are defined by our insight into ourselves, especially by the realization of the inevitability of death. Human cultures and civilizations are just various attempts to create meaningful myths that help us obscure this fact. We hide behind our traditions, our institutions, our religions, our fandoms, in order to stop ourselves from going insane. In order to avoid being brought down by hopelessness and dread, we live inside elaborate lies, or hero systems. While Walter Lippmann believed that democratic societies had to rely on necessary illusions in order to function, Becker believed that providing illusions was what all societies were for. As mortal creatures, we have to create something bigger than ourselves, some mythic being that will support us. We need something infinite to align ourselves with in order to avoid being driven into disorder by the realization of our finitude. And this is why he opposed Marxism as a utopian project that could never be realized. Marx wanted to make our own society transparent to us and to liberate humanity so we could act to create a new world. But according to Becker, the true consequence of demystifying society would only be to create a psychotic reaction. However, this complaint about socialism and Marx applies equally to any secular society. The problem of death isn't overcome by capitalism either, but instead it is only partially managed. Our capitalist society both denies us the ability to take control of our relations and renders these relations hollow, base, and alienating. We have arrived in a moment when we can neither be transparent to ourselves nor believe in the old illusions. We cannot bear to face reality, but we also can't avoid facing it. The School of Materialist Research is a self-sustainable platform where ideas are discussed in ways that would not be possible in conventional academia. The school is defined by its interest in the materialist approach to knowledge. Among its faculty are Julia Kristeva, Amanda Beach, Ben Woodward, Thomas Nail, and Paul Cockshott. The deadline for applications is September 11th. Check out the link to the School of Materialist Research in the description for this video. In Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, he sets up his argument for the need to abandon a human-oriented perspective and to prioritize the notion of a world without us by pointing to the problem of modernity. He wrote that a cynic might argue that the modern secular worldview never fully took hold. That is, we are still well entrenched inside various heroic myths, only now the responsibility for maintaining mythic thinking falls not to any oral tradition or religious practice, not on these alone anyhow, but instead, the mythological has become the stuff of the culture industry. The old theologians have been replaced by politicians, and the philosophers have been transformed into self-help gurus. In the middle of the 20th century, there was Norman Vincent Peale, whilst today we have, or at least had, Jordan Peterson. From the point of view of Ernest Becker, this complaint that the scientific worldview of the Enlightenment hasn't yet arrived, the cynical observation that today movie superheroes and TV police detectives have taken up the roles that used to be fulfilled by Christ, Buddha, or Muhammad, would be good news. It would be good news except for the fact that movie superheroes and TV detectives are considered childish and unserious. To believe that Columbo will deliver salvation or that Superman will redeem the human race is, of course, absurd. And according to Becker, the one thing that modern people can no longer muster is faith in absurdities. But according to Becker, if we could put our faith in Clark Kent, we would be better off as people. We would be able to sustain simple lives, the lives of Philistines, who are satisfied with what is, because what is what Superman gave us. We turn wrong, according to Becker, when we try to stand on our own 2 feet and dare to question. As Freud once said, the aim of psychoanalysis is to replace the suffering of the neurotic or the psychotic with normal, functional unhappiness. According to Becker, human beings need to find some sort of external support in order to live their lives. This is the reason we are so prone to enact what Freud called transference, to invest other people and their ideas with fantastic significance. Freud believed that our primal sexual and violent desires, developed in our infancy and directed at our parents, were sublimated into fantasies and dreams, wherein, through fragmentation and metaphor, we could allow ourselves to fulfill our wishes, at least partially. The purpose of civilization was to organize the successful sublimation of our libidinal impulses, to both frustrate and realize our desires. Becker believed that transference was organized not around the libido, but as a shield against understanding more existential truths. We transfer power onto parental figures and heroes not so much in an effort to realize our unconscious desires, but out of a need to create the illusion of an infinite and permanent reality that we can align ourselves with in order to achieve a kind of symbolic immortality. But both Freud and Becker believed that the aim should be the adjustment of people to the awfulness of life. For Freud, the aim was to transform the sickest people into merely sick people. For Becker, the aim was, despite the dangers involved, to help people to become heroic and noble. But neither Becker nor Freud believed that the aim should be to help people achieve transcendence. In The Denial of Death, Becker stated his position plainly. He wrote, "There's simply no way to transcend the limits of the human condition or to change the psychological structural conditions that make humanity possible." The complaint that Becker aimed at utopians and socialists was that they wanted to liberate man from his condition. The communists wanted to set off in all directions. They wanted to face reality and overcome it. But such an endeavor would only produce schizophrenic disorder. In the previous video, I explored how, in the late 20th century, authors like Kurt Vonnegut abandoned the idea of progress in favor of a fragmented and partial satisfaction, or, if not that, then in favor of a coping strategy. If we were to take Becker and Freud seriously, then this approach to literature and life might be justifiable. However, it only seems that way if we remain within the realm of psychology, if we restrict ourselves to questioning the mental health of individuals, or trying to determine how to produce mental health in individuals. What isn't acceptable isn't justifiable. It's a perpetual crisis that we see spilling over from the economic realm to our politics. What isn't acceptable is the fact that 11% of the world is malnourished while farmers destroy their harvests in order to keep prices high. What isn't acceptable is the spread of disease and the millions who are dying so young. What isn't acceptable is how we cannot change our collective lives in order to stave off ecological collapse. How we have bombed our way through the first 20 years of the 20th century. Marx's unique contribution was not his atheism. His critique of political economy was not an ideological critique. It did not just amount to realizing that God was dead or that the Protestant worth ethic wasn't universal. What Marx realized was that the ideology that drives our productive activity, the ideas that determine how, why, and when we grow crops, build shelter, sew together, clothing, these ideas determine the material outcomes of our collective lives. Transference, whether it is based on the fear of death or on the need to sublimate our unconscious sexual desires, doesn't explain the mechanism that drives our productive lives, but only helps to explain why we're invested in our own exploitation. Nobody can take full responsibility for the mythic and psychological structures that justify their practices. We can only transfer that responsibility upwards or sideways. This is why an institution of authority is necessary if we're to change society. However, what we can justify is the creation of that institution and the aim of that institution. We can reduce the problem of revolution from the problem of existence to the problem of organizing production and distribution, away from creating meaning, which happens reflexively and unconsciously, to the problem of creating a framework for cooperation in order to provide a common store of goods. In the last video, I said I'd explore the various solutions to the socialist calculation problem in this video. Instead, I'll take that issue up in a future episode of Pop the Left, because I think the dry details of socialist calculation would be more fun to explore in a conversation with Derek Varn than they would be to produce a video about. But this other problem, this question of how to create a revolution that doesn't require people to take responsibility for creating their own meaning, that leaves some of the myths we've grown up with in place, is what I find myself perpetually vexed by and obsessed with, and I'll surely return to it in future videos. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.